I've noticed as I get older how important memories are to me. Memories of people, places and events, and they can be both pleasurable and sad. Sad because, of course, the passage of time means that friends and family may no longer be with us, and some of those buildings and places that we remembered have changed or have even been demolished. Of course, those memories can be very pleasurable because, as I say, they can remind you of people and events. But we must always be careful that we don't view the past through rose-colored spectacles, because my memory of an event can be very different to that of somebody else's who may have been there at the same time. We all have our own individual memories, and the route we take can be very, very different to other people. So, with that caveat in mind, today we're embarking on a little bit of unashamed nostalgia. This place, Bridgend, was so very important to me when I was a kid. Unlike so many places in Wales, it's absolutely rich in history. But we can't tell the story in full, but rather cherry-pick those places and those times that were so important to me when I was a youngster. I so vividly remember this place, the old bridge, a hen bont, and it's marvellous. Got all the information here on this commemorative plaque. Built in 1425, don't know by who was actually responsible for it, but it was repaired in 1775 because on the 21st of August that year, massive floods washed away two of the arches, and that must have been a glorious summer, washed away two of those arches, and then the bridge was reopened by being spanned by the single arch and the original ones on the far side. Before the spate of bridge building in the 19th century, this was the only dry crossing across Afon Ogor for many, many miles, so it was absolutely vital to the development of the town. I have a very potent personal memory of this place because it was here during term time every morning. We queued up on the bridge waiting for the Bridgend Preparatory and Commercial School, or as it was more commonly known, the Prep, to be opened by its headmistress, Miss Kathleen Sambrook-Jones, and her assistant, Miss Nancy Rees. Now that was a school that was in so many senses can be described as Dickensian because of the standard of education and the conditions that prevailed. No trace now remains. It was somewhere just behind me there, completely swept away when the new road was built in the early 1960s. We've come across a few photographs of the exterior of the school, but sadly I've not been able to find anything of the interior, which is a shame because I would love to see it to remind me of what the conditions were really like. But I do have a copy of the inspector's report about the closure of the school in the 1950s. They served notice on its closure because of the very poor standards of teaching and accommodation. And the conclusion of the report was, well, to say the very least, pretty damning. This is what they said. The defects in the premises, the serious deficiency in nearly all the equipment considered necessary for pupils of secondary school age, the narrowness of the curriculum, the considerable diversity in age, ability and attainment among the pupils together create conditions in which the education of the pupils falls far short of what can be considered a reasonably efficient education. Now I know it's difficult to believe, but this was once a tranquil road, a lane that meandered down alongside the river towards Newbridge Fields, and of course the open-air swimming pool that had been opened in 1938. But sometimes that tranquility was disturbed by the clanking and the noise from the old Corona pop factory that was located just across the road here. Our lunch breaks were taken either in the British restaurant in Adair Street or here in what was the Windsor Fish and Chip restaurant. And the advantage of eating here was, of course, that you could have your pine chips in a bag, in a newspaper, and then you could consume it en route to the Luke. This door was the entrance to the Luke, the Lucania billiard room, which was located on the first floor. And it was one of a chain of billiard halls, temperance billiard halls, taking its name from the RMS Lucania that was broken up in Swansea in 1909. Evidently, in every club there was a little bit of the ship on display. And entering into the large room, up the narrow stairway, was to walk into a place of calm and quietness, the only sound being a background of quiet chatter, punctuated by the click of snooker balls. I think it cost 4p a game, and as we had over an hour for lunch, there was more than enough time to enjoy ourselves. Well, just down to my left-hand side is Adair Street, and it was one of the busy shopping centres in Bridgend, but it was here that was located the British restaurant, or as it was more correctly known at the time, the Civic restaurant. British restaurants were opened up in World War II to provide cheap, nutritious food. And those, of course, were in the days before fast food venues, although Bridgend could boast its very own sandwich bar. You know, my memories of the British restaurant are now quite vague. In fact, I'm not quite certain which building it actually was. But what I do remember was the friendliness of the waitresses, and they were there in their little hats, spotless white aprons, and they used to address me as Master Richard. And there I would be, 11, 12-year-old boy, sitting down, sharing a table with the august local businessman. The usual fare was soup, meat and 2 veg, and once a week, delight upon delights, jam, roly pudding and custard. And we youngsters were often encouraged to go around behind the serving screens for seconds. The building dated from 1874, when the Ogmore Lodge of Freemasons was established, although Freemasonry in the town was established towards the end of the 18th century. Travelling to Bridgend, of course, was by bus. And just behind me, this was where the original bus station was located. It was established by the Western Welsh Bus Company in the 1920s, serving an area of Mid Glamorgan and much, much further afield. And indeed, Bridgend was a very important transport hub at that time. One of my great adventures was the first time I was allowed to travel to Cardiff unaccompanied on the famous N&C coaches, the brown bombers as they were known, and some of the coaches had doors that were halfway along the body. And what I do remember was when you paid your fare, the conductor would come along with his or her little machine, and they would write out your fare and your destination on the ticket on the top of the machine, and then press the handle, and out popped your means of transportation. I got to know the bus timetables very well, certainly including the times of the last bus, because I may have been to the pictures or dancing, because Bridgend initially was the focal point for my hedonistic pleasures. And I well recall the Embassy Cinema. It was just behind me here. It was opened in 1939 in the Art Deco style. We all considered the Embassy quite a posh place to go, but it was certainly a great place to go on a Sunday evening, because in my home village The 3 cinemas there were closed on the Sabbath, but here in Bridgend, you could come and enjoy the pleasures of the moving pictures. And Bridgend had 2 other important cinemas. There was the Palace Cinema, and that was great because upstairs on the back row they had double seats. And then there was also the cinema, which was initially called the Electric Light Cinema, and that was opened in 1912. It was one of the first purpose-built cinemas in the whole of South Wales at that time when moving pictures were starting to become so incredibly popular. But for dancing and to chat up the girls, where else but the exotically named Palais de Danse. It was a building that was opened in 1954 and was really, in the 50s and the 60s, the place to come to go dancing and hear some very, very well-known bands. We were just up the road a moment ago and asked somebody where exactly was the Palais located, and they then came down and pointed out this lovely plaque which celebrates the dance hall. And there's a great poem here. The land you're standing on is special to the town. It once housed a dance floor for folk all around. Take a look down at the ground underneath your feet. Imagine a wood-sprung dance floor on which great crowds could meet. And so it goes on. Here we are. Through the 50s and 60s, young girls travelled to town by bus, rushing to the dressing rooms for a last-minute fuss, checking lipstick, hair, and puffing hooped petticoats coated with sugar before being whisked off by a fella to dance with great vigour. And it goes on. This is absolutely marvellous. While the Palais is no longer, we are learning from the building blocks of our past and take comfort knowing that Og Diaries will ensure these memories will last. There's at least one thing in life that we can guarantee, and that's change. And as the demand for large dance halls, large cinemas declined, so both the Palais and the Embassy were swept away to be replaced by, what else? Car parking. Well, I'm in my 7th heaven because this is a wonderful bit of serendipity. We had no idea there was going to be this classic car event here in Bridgend, but seeing these vehicles really takes me back to my youth. I used to actually own an A35 van, and then later on I owned an MGB Roadster. So what a wonderful coincidence today. So pleased to be sitting in an A35 van, because it was one quite similar to this, was the first vehicle that I ever owned. And it was so important to me because it liberated me. I could travel anywhere, and I went off exploring all the nooks, crannies and corners across this wonderful country of ours here in Wales. You know, so many of Bridgend's iconic buildings have disappeared, and it was with complete astonishment that when I was driving through the town in 1971, I saw the magnificent town hall in the process of being demolished. I could hardly believe my eyes because it was such an important statement on the attitude of our Victorian forebears. What I find very moving is that Bridgend in the middle of the 19th century was a relatively small market town. It had a population of about 4,000 people, yet such was the pride and confidence of the people in the town that they were able to erect such an outstanding edifice right here in the centre. Since the 16th century, and indeed earlier, Bridgend was an important market centre. But in the 19th century, things started to change because industry was developing in the valleys to the north, and the character of Bridgend was influenced by that. And so, the need for a building that was large enough to accommodate all the changes that were taking place at the time, that building was very, very important, and that purpose was marvellously served by the old town hall. However, perhaps there were those who bewailed the passing of the first town hall that lasted from 1788 until 1834, but was demolished because it was in poor repair, and here's a familiar 21st century phrase, and because it was a traffic obstacle. However, even though there have been many changes, it's still possible to find buildings that speak so eloquently of life, terms and conditions of some people in the 19th century. These buildings, for instance, now they provide private accommodation, but when they were built in 1837, they were for the poor and the indigent, as they were then known. Of course, this is the workhouse. You know, so much has been written about the terrible conditions that existed in the workhouses of Britain. Not sure about this place. It may have been good, it may have been bad, but certainly workhouses are the places where families could be separated. Husbands separated from wives, children separated from parents, men to the right, women to the left. And also, besides the rather more permanent accommodation for those people at the time, there was also an area which was known as the casual or the vagrants ward, where the tramps could find accommodation overnight. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, I was an apprentice painter with Glamorgan County Council, and this is one of the buildings we worked on. We knew it as the Spike, and I never queried why it was so called until years later when I became involved with the social history and discovered that it took its name from the fact that the vagrants, the tramps who went into the casual ward for overnight stay, they had to pay for their overnight accommodation by picking oakum and spreading it apart by using a spike, a pointed implement, and that was such a hard, vile job. I also worked here at the cottage homes. Now we can see that they're private houses, but when the original houses were built in 1879, they were part of an innovative and, for then, very enlightened way of dealing with children in need. Each house had its own, quote, mother, and when I was working here, I seem to recall that there were about 8 or so kids in each one. Of course, I only had a superficial glimpse of what life was like for those kids in these homes, but it struck me that they seemed to be fairly well cared for. Originally, these buildings were constructed by the Board of Guardians, but when I knew it, they were in the care of Glamorgan County Council. Architecturally, Bridgend is very much a Victorian and Edwardian town, but of course there are buildings from earlier periods, including this wonderful castle, the New Castle, with this lovely decorative main gate, situated in this strategic point high above the fording place on the river. Along with St. Esther's Church, this is now a conservation area. This was a great place to visit during lunch breaks from school, and it was perfect if you wanted to have an illicit fag. Surprisingly, it was many, many years later before I actually got inside this building, although passed it so many times. But as the plaque says, this is the oldest habitable building extant in Bridgend, dating from the 16th century. St. John's House takes its name from its association, or possible association, with the Knights Hospitals, and it's also thought to have been a port of call for pilgrims going to and fro St. David's, because of course crossing over the ford and then the medieval bridge at the bottom end of this hill and making their way along the main road towards the west. Architecturally, well, both outside and inside, This building is chock-a-block with very fascinating historic features and full marks to the charitable trust who are responsible for caring for it. One of the nice architectural features about Bridgend is that many of the buildings have been constructed out of this lovely green-grey stone that was quarried about half a mile away from between the 15th and the 19th centuries. Indeed, this is Quarella Road, which is an anglicisation of the original Welsh term for quarries, Quarelli. And it was along this road that the track of the Bridgend Railway was built in 1829. This is another important part of Bridgend's railway history, and it's easy to walk by and not notice this single-storey building with its lovely stone carved arches. But this was part of the South Wales Railway that was opened in June 1851 between Gloucester and Milford Haven. No less a luminary than Isambard Kingdom Brunel was responsible for the construction of the line and the design of this station. And the original line, of course, was broad gauge. I remember I must have been about 7, 8 or 9, waiting for a train here with my father. And he turned to me and he said, "Do you know you can go to anywhere in the world from Bridgend railway station?" And I was so astonished and so impressed, and I had no idea that Bridgend was so important in terms of the world scale. I love this. This is a terrific example of a high Victorian monument in memory of the Randall family. And important because no less a person than the great photographer Fox Talbot was here in 1860 to photograph the unveiling of this structure. And of course behind is another nice piece of Victoriana, the police station. One of my good friends when I was in the prep, he came from a farming family from the Vale of Glamorgan. And quite often we used to come up, I think it was on a Wednesday, to the weekly cattle market here, where we would sometimes meet his father and family. And that was a completely new experience for me, because I was brought up in a mining valley a few miles to the north, where our life was dictated by the colliery hooters that went off signalling the change of shifts, 3 shifts a day. And then when I came here and met the farming community, I realized that their life operated to a different beat. Their life operated to the change of seasons. The market was so very important to Bridgend. Even as early as 1700, Edward Lloyd came here and he said that it was somewhere where is kept every Saturday a great market, wherein is sold corn, victuals, often cattle, and other merchandise are sold. And I find it quite interesting now when you think about not that many years ago, you came here and you bought your beef on the hoof, as it were. Now you can go to the supermarket, dip into a deep freeze and pull out a packet of whatever you like contained in a plastic bag. So my memories of this town and the times I spent here are very mixed. Sometimes they're fairly clear, but mostly they're rather hazy. And not in any chronological order. I remember the narrow wooden bridge that could be wobbled most satisfactorily, the shop that sold sticky drinks dispensed from spherical containers for a penny, dodging quickly in and out of Ben's drugstore for something for the weekend, the sweet counter at Woolworths, the covered market, Wong's Chinese laundry, and the old tollgate cottage on Coity Road. I know it's a cliche, but the past is indeed all around us in the forms of buildings, landscapes, and of course wonderful classic cars. We need memory to get us through life, but we have to be cautious, as the playwright Harold Pinter said. He wrote, "The past is what you remember, imagine you remember, convince yourself remember, or pretend to remember." But my memories and reflections of Bridgend are all of that. And with the passing of the years, I recall some good times and some not so good times. But it's been a particular pleasure to have the opportunity to recall those days of my youth here in Bridgend, just a tiny little spot in the historic landscape of Wales.